Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. Today we'll be looking at one of our series of videos looking at World War I. The textbook reading for this particular section is America Prepares for War, pages 725 to 729. Our guiding questions today are, how did America mobilize for war in World War I? How did women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans get impacted on the home front during World War I? What was the Great Migration? And then how did U.S. military involvement tip the scales on the battlefields during World War I? When America declares war in 1917 with an act of Congress, America really wasn't prepared to go to war. We only had a standing army of about 200,000 soldiers, and even though we were providing supplies and assistance to our allies, Great Britain and France, we weren't really quite ready to mobilize for this massive undertaking of fighting. So the actions of the federal government that will be taking place in 1917 and 1918 really were kind of efforts to get America on a very sure war footing. One such way that the government did this was by passing a law called the Selective Service Act, which in 1917 Congress will pass this law requiring men between the ages of 21 and 30 to be registered to get drafted. And about 3 million Americans will be drafted into military service between this time period. Some will volunteer, some will get drafted, and that 3 million, about 400,000 African American soldiers will be fighting in World War I as well. However, at this time period, much like in the Civil War and during the Spanish-American War, African American troops were fighting in segregated units. So they were not allowed to fight along white soldiers. They were in segregated units. Of course, we have the very iconic Uncle Sam poster, "I Want You," for the U.S. Army. There was a huge effort with the Selective Service Act of 1917 and an effort with these recruiting posters to get young men to quickly volunteer, people like my great Uncle Frank, to fight over in France in World War I. Other ways that the government will kind of help support the war effort was by passing these things called Liberty Bonds. These were basically things that you sold to raise money. So people could buy the Liberty Bonds and support the war effort this way without having to necessarily pay higher taxes. You can buy these bonds, and this gives the government money very rapidly. Then it could then use to help with the war effort. Then as the years go on, if you want to sell your Liberty Bonds when the war is over, you should be able to get that money back plus some additional interest, which is the incentive for you to buy a Liberty Bond. These become more important during World War II, as we'll talk about when we get into World War II, but they will be started in World War I too, with kind of a way to raise billions of dollars. Another way to kind of control media and information in World War I, the government will pass two key laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. Both of these laws are going to be limiting free speech. In fact, during the passage of these two laws, about 900 opponents of the war will be arrested and jailed for speaking out against America's involvement in World War I. The Sedition Act is no longer a law on the books, obviously because it would be a violation of the First Amendment. However, the Espionage Act, which is actively spying on our country, is still illegal. It's still an act that's still kind of into effect today. This undergone some modifications over the almost 100 years of its existence, but it's still there today. And as you can see from some of these posters here, I pledge allegiance and silence about the war. So one action that government will do is kind of put a limit on anti-war activism and also on preventing kind of dissent about the conflict and spying for the enemy on American soil. In terms of industry and mobilizing industry, the government will also do some things as well to kind of help oversee the transition of the U.S. economy to being more on a war footing. The War Industries Board, or the WIB, will oversee the production of special raw ingredients needed for military weaponry, things like steel, copper, cement, and rubber. The Food Administration kind of helped increase food supplies for soldiers across the country by encouraging farmers to grow more. It also helped raise prices for farmers so they can be paid more for their crops, to encourage them to grow more food. Americans were sort of encouraged to not buy from the local grocery store or the local market, but to grow their own fruits and vegetables. That way they don't have to buy from the large-scale farms. That food can be sort of distributed directly to the soldiers. And of course, the National War Labor Board was also created during World War I as a way to help workers stay on factories, preventing them from striking and avoiding work stoppages, which, again, this is kind of during that time period of the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era. You have this rising interest of workers to unionize and fight for better working conditions and higher salary. But during the war, the government did not want to see strikes happening to stop workage, and so they had this board to kind of act as a mediator between management and between the unions to make sure that work continued to happen and there was no work stoppages. The impact World War I had on women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans was pretty dramatic, as a lot of young men are going to go now fight overseas in Europe. There's a need for a lot more workers, so we see an increase of women in the workplace, especially in what was seen as non-traditional female jobs like factory workers. So we see women, African Americans, and Mexican American workers are kind of encouraged to work in those factories to help support the war effort. During this time period, we also will see a kind of movement of African Americans out of the Deep South to the North, in large part to help find work in some of these labor shortages that was facing the northern factories because of all these Americans going and fighting over in World War I. So as soldiers went off to fight, there's a labor shortage in a lot of these northern factories, and about 500,000 African Americans between 1910 and 1920. So it started a little bit before World War I. It definitely increased during World War I. And then as we got into the 1920s, it continued on. About 500,000 African Americans will move into places like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, looking for better job opportunities to kind of escape racial violence and bigotry in the South, and sharecropping and poverty in the South as well. So as we think about the impact of World War I on other groups like women and minority groups, that will have a huge impact in helping them go and find jobs in some of these factories needed for the war effort. How did Americans' involvement help in the war? Well, in 1918, as thousands of, hundreds of thousands, almost 3 million by the time it's all said and done, of American soldiers arriving into Europe is just what is needed, fresh troops to kind of end the stalemate in Europe between the Allies and the Central Powers. For really since the war began, neither side was really getting a decisive victory. It was those trench warfare, no man's land. Both sides were fighting over inches and feet. Neither side was gaining much of an advantage. With millions of new American soldiers coming into the battlefields of France in World War I, these fresh troops being able to be thrown into these battles is going to be just enough to kind of help end the stalemate and lead to an Allied victory in Europe. And Germany is kind of starting to reel back, and they're suffering from starvation and lack of supplies and resources. They've taken very heavy casualties as well. And though by the time we get to 1918, the war is pretty much coming. By the end of 1918, the war is starting to come closer to an end. The U.S. involvement does play a very important role. The numbers of fresh troops plays a very important role in ending World War I. So that is the look at how World War I impacted the home front during World War I. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions, please come sure to talk to your teacher. Thank you.